question and answer period with the author of Rainy Lake House, Ted Catton. Ted was kind enough to agree to look over these questions that were generated by the readers group. There's been some editing, clarification, make the questions a little easier to understand and answer by both Ted himself as well as Dale and I. But these questions came from the group. We started collecting the questions early in 2021 by logging them into a question bank that Dale has kept. And whenever we would have our learning circle meetings or our general meetings, any questions that would come up or show up in the chat, Dale would copy them down. And so he had a pretty good bank of questions to start with. We also solicited some questions for Ted when he came to Grand Marais this fall and spoke at Drury Lane. And so some more questions came at us that way. And in the meantime, a few more questions have drifted in, and we've had enough time for Ted to take a look at them and go through this editing process. And so now here we are. We're ready to just go ahead and shout them out. But first, I'd like to introduce Dale Willis, who's co-coordinator of the Rainy Lake House Readers Group.
Hi, everyone. We're so happy that you're here and that Ted's here to share all of his knowledge and wisdom with us.
And then Ted, if you could kind of get us familiar with yourself, just a little brief about what's going on with you these days.
Sure. I'm Ted Catton. I'm living in Missoula, Montana. I'm in my house here. Glad to be joining for this Zoom call. I was really glad to be able to meet some of the folks in the Learning Circle at Drury Lane Books last September. It's a really neat thing that you've organized, and it's so fun to be a part of it this way. Really enjoyed getting to see a little bit of the North Shore in September too, and what a great part of the world y'all live in. So looking forward to this conversation today.
Kelsey, do you just want to tell us a little bit about your role here and how that's working?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I'm Kelsey Kennedy. I work for Cook County Higher Ed. I'm kind of in the background today, just making sure the technology is all working smoothly. Our organization is just helping to partner with you all to bring this together. And we're excited to see what we can and learn what we can from Ted as well. This is an exciting opportunity. Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So Dale's going to start out with the first question, and then as much as we can, we'll alternate questions between Dale and I. So go ahead.
Okay, so Ted, the first question was about the title. How did you arrive at Rainy Lake House? Is it just a translation of Lac La Pluie?
Well, no, I mean, it is. Yeah, it's a translation of Lac La Pluie, and Lac La Pluie was the more common name you see in all the fur trade documents, but I like the English name for my English readers. And I liked Rainy Lake House because I think this is fundamentally a place-centered history. It's some might call it a micro history, getting into the details of what the fur trade was like from the standpoint of individual experience. I thought the name Rainy Lake House conveyed that that's kind of the approach, is that it's very local or place-centered. But I'll say too that to me, I've always kind of liked the sound of Rainy Lake House, or in my part of the world out west, a town up in Alberta called Rocky Mountain House. And these are old terms that go back to the fur trade era. And it's a very, to me, it has a very Canadian ring to it. It's not a fort, it's not a post, it's a house. And you don't come across that geographical term in the United States. So I like that aspect of it too.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, great. Ted, this is a kind of a grouping of questions, and they're all kind of related. So you can pull them apart or just freelance them. But why did you write this book, and how did it come about? What were the origins of this story for you? We thought that weaving the three characters together into a story was just brilliant. And you know, how did you arrive at this intersection, this kind of Venn diagram of Mclaughlin, Tanner, and Long? So
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that I think the fur trade fascinated me because it's an environment, it's a social environment that's, on the one hand, a very brutal place, very harsh conditions and relationships there. You know, you see people fighting one another. You know, it's a harsh environment, and yet there's all these glimmers of humanity that filter through that. That you know, people taking care of one another. Europeans and Indians marrying one another, finding out ways to get along. To explain that, it really needed, I felt like, to get down into the level of individuals, to kind of illustrate that sort of contradiction or that juxtaposition of a brutal environment, but also a very humane one. I came at these three characters, I think, first by way of John Mclaughlin. I think I was probably first introduced to him when I was reading the Lac La Pluie journal, the Hudson Bay Company journal, for that post. And I can talk a little more, maybe a little later on, about why I was doing that research. But I think it was reading that journal where I was introduced to John Mclaughlin, the first of the three people. And I'll just delve into a little bit about the incident that caught my attention that I think kind of illustrates that juxtaposition of, you know, a brutal yet humane environment. I guess many of you, most of you will have read the book and you're familiar with the incident, but John Tanner was a white Indian, a captive that was living with the Indians, and he was shot and severely wounded and was recovering from his wound at the Rainy Lake house. So John Mclaughlin was, as a trained medical doctor as well as a trader, was taking care of Tanner as Tanner convalesced. And so there was that, you know, that caring that was going on. But at the same time, it was clear in the journal that John Mclaughlin had a very self-interested or business-interested perspective on the situation, which was that the Indians who were associated with John Tanner might worry that the traders would take revenge for the attempted killing of John Tanner by taking some of them and killing them, or doing some harm back to those Indians. Therefore, those Indians might be reluctant to come trade at the trading house. So that was just, I thought, a fascinating sort of hard-nosed business interest in. So John Mclaughlin was recognizing that by taking care of Tanner in the Rainy Lake house, he might be jeopardizing the business of the house, you know, driving the Indians away. And then I found that, you know, John Tanner, in reading that John Tanner's own story, had a very different perspective on that situation. And then I realized, you know, that there was an American perspective from across the river, the rival fur trade company there. And Stephen Long, coming through as an explorer into this situation, brought that American perspective. So that incident, that situation, I think really sparked my interest in thinking, well, how can you explain this complicated environment from the perspective of individual lives and how they're all interacting with one another. And I guess to go on with this a little bit longer, John Mclaughlin was an obvious choice because I knew a little bit about John Mclaughlin from living out west, that he became a very important figure in early Oregon history. And he has a solid reputation in history as a humanitarian. So I knew I would get that from his biography. And then John Tanner was an obvious choice to focus on because there's no equivalent account to his of what it was like to live an Indian life in that part of the world. And, there may be some limitations to how Indian was John Tanner, how Ojibwa was his perspective, but it's the best we have. And it's a pretty darn compelling story that he has. But the third person in that sort of triangulation was a little more up in the air. And it did turn out actually that when I was first really kind of pondering this, there was a fellow named Joseph Delafield, who was with the American Border marking expedition. I forget what they called that, but he went through a couple of weeks before Stephen Long and actually had more contact with Tanner and direct contact there where Tanner was convalescing. And I first thought about looking at Joseph Delafield, but I quickly realized, even though Delafield wrote a book about his experience, he just wasn't a well enough known historical figure, and I just wasn't going to be able to come up with enough on him. And then I realized that Stephen Long came through 2 weeks later, and I could make it work. And Stephen Long, to me, had just the right amount of, he was just famous enough so that there's going to be quite a bit of information about him, but he wasn't so famous that he could kind of represent that sort of everyday person perspective that you would get with, John Mclaughlin being a trader and John Tanner being a hunter, pursuing the Indian way of life as a hunter. So Stephen Long seemed like, a somewhat similar social milieu, not a great man of history, but there was a lot I could find about him. So I thought that those three would work, and I just love the idea of sort of being able to triangulate through them on this complicated society, with John Tanner being the perspective of the Indian, the perspectives of sort of the working class hunter in this economic enterprise, and John Mclaughlin being representative of a sort of British American or Canadian perspective, and being the trader, the sort of bourgeois trader in the managerial class in this economic enterprise. And then Stephen Long representing kind of the nicely, in a way, kind of the naive perspective of an explorer, of coming into this area and looking around, which is what the reader is doing essentially. But also Stephen Long brings to it the American, sort of an official American perspective. And I think there was a lot to be said, maybe I'll be able to get into this a little later, but there was a lot to be said about the American perspective on white Indian relations, federal U.S. federal Indian policy, and just sort of concepts about who Indian people are, and Stephen Long became kind of a vehicle for getting into all those things.
Okay, Ted, so our third question is about your research process. everything is so well documented, and we're wondering how much time did you actually have to spend in the libraries and online and visiting sites to get that story together?
Well, I guess to give a little perspective on how I got into this in occupationally, I do work for the National Park Service on a contract basis. And so I had the fortune of going into Voyageurs National Park on an assignment, a contract, and that's where my research began. So I did field research there, and went to Lincoln, Nebraska, where the Park Service has a unit called the Midwest Archaeological Center. And I know that some of you in the Learning Circle have had the benefit of reading the Hudson Bay Company journals and some other journals that have been transcribed by the National Park Service. Mona Hunter wrote about that recently in her piece on exploring the site of Rainy Lake House. But anyway, I got to go in there and I was amazed at how much work the Park Service had done in the way of transcribing these journals. So that was just felt like a gold mine to be able to go into those. And the project paid for me to get out to Ottawa, to the National Archives of Canada, which was a lovely trip. It was a really fun place to work. I never did get up to Winnipeg to the archives there, but I was able to get the all of the Hudson Bay Company journals that I needed by way of microfilm through the interlibrary loan. So that was a real asset. And I did spend time in St. Paul at the Minnesota Historical Society. And all that research I did under contract to the Park Service. But then that was in 1999, 2000. And this became kind of a hobby. And I spent years and years, researching more secondary sources, published primary sources, interlibrary loaning those journals from the Winnipeg, from Hudson Bay Company archives. Forgetting exactly what the question was, but I think it was sort of asking about my research. And
how much time you spent on gathering all of that information.
Okay, yeah. So that most of it was in 1999, 2000. And then, or I shouldn't say most of it, but that was the impetus for it. And then I spent, golly, a decade looking into other sources, adding to my knowledge and, adding to my research. And I wrote most of it in 2010, 2011, 2012, in that time period.
Excellent. Thanks, Ted.
Yeah.
Oh, a decade. Oh, yeah. When we, as a group, were talking about references, Selkirk Papers kept coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And none of us have seen the Selkirk Papers or really even know what they are. Is that something that you referenced?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Lord Selkirk was the major figure in the Hudson Bay Company in the background of the story, and as I recall, his papers are not just what he wrote, but there's quite a lot in there of other people's correspondence as well. And they have all been put onto microfilm. I think I looked at them in, can't recall now if I looked at microfilm or if I looked at the originals, but it was at the National Archives of Canada in Ottawa. But I believe I also looked at some by way of microfilm later. So I think they're pretty accessible as all being on microfilm.
So obviously this is a lot of information. How did you manage physically, technically, all of that knowledge so that you could bring it into some cohesive mass of information to help you write your book?
Yeah, it's, I don't know, I mean, it's not so different from what all historians do. I think that, and I feel like when I look back on it, actually, my research collection on this particular project is pretty hybrid, in that early in my time as a historian, I was doing the old-fashioned taking note cards on index cards. And, that seems pretty old-fashioned now, but I actually did some of that for Rainy Lake House. Then again, I was also collecting articles by way of PDF on my computer hard drive, and I've got a lot of those. And then I had, I think, research files of Xerox copies of articles that I'd gathered. So that was, yet another sort of medium. But it was, so I think it was kind of a hybrid approach. But I think what my organizing principle for all this was, once I had these three characters, I was really focused on documenting their lives and then getting all the corroborating sources I could ever find to sort of provide context and also verify what they said was, what really happened. So that kind of focused me on what I was looking for. And I just started building up my research collection from that.
So now that you have the material and you've got the story, did you have to start looking for a publisher, or did you go to University of Minnesota Press, or how did that work for you?
Sure. Well, in my previous books, I had gone to academic presses, and my previous books were a little more of sort of an academic stripe, I guess. And with Rainy Lake House, I was had the ambition of reaching a more of a popular audience, which with you folks up in your part of the woods, I've succeeded in doing that. But I had in mind that I was hoping I would reach a wide popular audience for this work. And so I think I didn't actually go to university presses. I found a literary agent, and that was the first time I'd ever done that. But I'll tell you, it was a struggle, and I started keeping an Excel spreadsheet of all my attempts to find a literary agent, and I got right up to about 100 when I finally found one. And then the literary agent took a long time to find a publisher. So in the final analysis, the reason it was Johns Hopkins University Press was because I got lucky that the editor, the acquisitions editor there, her name is Elizabeth Demers, and she read the manuscript and she really liked it because it meshed with one of her interests. She'd written her dissertation in history on the fur trade in Upper Michigan. So she really loved this manuscript, and she went to bat for it, and got a hold of my literary agent, and that's how it ended up with Johns Hopkins University Press.
Interesting. So now, moving from print to maybe film or TV, has Masterpiece or PBS approached you for a miniseries or anything like that?
Oh, that's such a flattering question. But I'll be honest, I would love that. So fantasy. No, I have not had any approaches along those lines. It would be, well, I'll just share this, that I have sort of a secondhand experience with that, in that my niece, Eleanor Catton, is a novelist, wrote a prize-winning novel. She's a New Zealander, and her novel, The Luminaries, was made into a 6-part BBC miniseries, and that came out just a year or two ago. And it's set on the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand in the gold rush. So watching this miniseries and having talked to my niece, here and there about the process, it was fun to watch, because the way that the miniseries did the costuming and the set design, it was fantastic. And it would be such a thrill to see Rainy Lake House come alive in that way. I don't
Well,
think it'll happen.
we agree. That's why we asked the question.
Yeah, yeah.
So Ted, of these three characters and this story, and they work so well, but did you have a favorite character, one that you really identified with or felt
Yeah,
closer to?
good question. It's one time I was sort of pondering, I guess, which one I would want to, have dinner with if I had the chance, or be most likely to feel like I could be a friend with or something. And so John Tanner, let me go one by one here a little bit. John Tanner, to me, is the most impressive in what he endured. His resilience, his fortitude, it just has a remarkable story to tell. He's also a very intense individual, and I think it'd be pretty hard to sit down with him and be friends with him. I sort of in the end felt like he was somewhat psychologically damaged, I think, from his childhood trauma and his hard life. And to take the next one, Stephen Long, to me, he is in a way the most approachable of the three characters. He's an explorer, and who doesn't admire that, seeking adventure and trying to further the knowledge of the world. And he was an intellectual. He was actually a teacher by background. He taught at West Point before he started exploring. He taught high school in Philadelphia before that too. So he had that sort of teacher personality, which I could relate to. I could, find approachable. But for my purposes, Stephen Long also represented a kind of an official perspective and reflected, kind of the racist ideas of the time. And not that he was any more racist than his fellow Americans, but in the end, that's kind of what comes through for me with his character. So that leaves John Mclaughlin, and what I like so much about John Mclaughlin. So the answer is John McLaughlin is the one I find the most admirable, the most that I like the most. And I think it's because even though he's just sort of this hard-nosed, practical businessman in some ways, he was humanitarian and he had a vision. And I think, it really comes out in the epilogue when he's out in Oregon that I think coming out of his fur trade experience, he had a vision for Oregon of developing into a multicultural society with tolerance towards other cultures. And as the American settlers moved into Oregon, they pretty much strangled that vision in the cradle. And McLaughlin wasn't able to do anything about it, but he never accepted that. And he took that vision with him to the end. And so that's what I love about John McLaughlin. I thought he had something to offer us in the 21st century in that.
So as we went through all of the book, and it struck us that it seemed to be a difference between the provisions provided by the HBC and the Northwest Company. Can you comment on how they differed?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think when I thought about that question, it's an interesting question. I feel like it's maybe not so much a difference between the two companies as it is determined by geography. So, for example, in the far north, where both the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company both had operations, the provisioning was heavily dominated by fish. Because there was no way to grow grain up in the far north. So fish and then in the wintertime, frozen fish was a mainstay. And Then when you come down into a more temperate latitude like Rainy Lake, there was more things like grain available as well as pemmican. But I think one thing we want to not overlook is that in both cases, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they weren't really bringing their provisions in from outside to any large extent. So there just wasn't the capacity in their transportation systems for that. So what they relied on instead was what was called the provisioning trade, which, I talk a little bit about this in the book. But alongside the fur trade, where the companies are trying to extract peltries and take them to sell them to Europe. Alongside that trade, there's also this provisioning trade where the Europeans are trading the Indians goods in exchange for provisions, for food of various kinds. And so in the Rainy Lake region, you find that the Indians were actually growing corn and selling some of it to the traders, which I thought was really fascinating. So I guess if there's a difference between the two companies, it might be that the Northwest Company developed that unique transportation system based on the canoe all the way from Montreal. And it went right through the Red River area. And so the Northwest Company, probably more than the Hudson Bay Company, gave a huge impetus to the pemmican trade. They kind of developed that. And they used it to supply their transportation system and supply system. And maybe they did that to a larger extent than the Hudson Bay Company, but I couldn't say that for sure. I'm confident about that. I think they both companies used the pemmican. But to me, the main thing is it varied geographically. And the farther south you went, the more opportunity there was to provision with grains, cereals, other things. And if you look at the fur trade out in Oregon, for instance, when Mclaughlin was out in Oregon, they were growing a lot of wheat alongside their trading posts to help with the provisioning.
I'm going to move ahead to a little bit. In a broad sense, how are these characters, the people in this fur trade and fur trade era, how are they different from us in energy level and stamina, resistance to cold?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, and I think we got that a little bit when we spoke at Drury Lane Books. At that time, I was marveling at I was at Grand Portage at the time, and marveling at how these people how the voyagers carried 2 90-pound packs on their backs over the Grand Portage Trail. And I think I was kind of glibly saying, there was a different species. We're a different species now than we were 200 or 300 years ago. And maybe in a too simplistic way, suggesting that we're a weaker species than we were 200 or 300 years ago. But yeah, I think in some ways, we're a bigger species than we were then. I mean, we're all taller, heavier. And I think that's because we've got, better nutrition now than we had 200 years ago. We've got access to better medicine. We're living longer. So, it's very different. We're a very different species in that regard. It's an amazing fast evolution. Anecdotally, when I think about Tanner's story, it's remarkable to me how that one individual had so many broken bones in his body over the course of one lifetime. And I think it's not just that he was exposed to a lot of things. I think probably his bones were more brittle than ours, perhaps, because they don't, they didn't have the same nutrition that we've got. So I think I would amend what I said last September, that we're probably physically, biologically stronger than those people. But it's fascinating that we can't imagine doing the things that they did. So I think it comes down to that as I was saying back in September, we're soft. We're incredibly soft by the standards of the fur trade people. But that's a cultural choice more than a physical limitation. So, we marvel at what they were able to do in terms of, canoeing thousands of miles, withstanding conditions that could have brought on hypothermia, surviving gunshot wounds and all those things. But I think it's not so much that we're physically weaker than them. It's just that our culture allows us to avoid all those situations, and we just we can't imagine putting ourselves through what they went through. So, I think it all comes down to more of a cultural evolution than the physical one.
And related to that, they certainly seemed fearless as you read the stories and the things that happened to them. How do you think they approached death, or the fear of death, or lack of fear of death, and how that might be different today?
Yeah, I think there is a real difference. I think that that there was more fatalism in their time. And I think it comes down to how close they were to premature death, in the sense that, there was accidents, there was disease could take people away. So they just lived with death close at hand in a much less predictable way than we do. And it affected their whole outlook on death, I would hazard to say. And I'm speaking here of both the Europeans and the Indians. And an example of their fatalism, I think, is that, back in the early 19th century, mariners or sailors, by and large, didn't know how to swim. They didn't bother to learn how to swim because they just figured if they went overboard, it was their time and they were going to die. So, I think that's an example of fatalism that we just have a hard time fathoming, but that's the way it was. But all that said, I would say that one thing that I think I learned writing Rainy Lake House was that I think there was a difference between the Europeans and the Indians in this way. I think the Indians were perhaps even more fatalistic, perhaps just because they lived all that much closer to death. They had even less control over the risks of death than the Europeans did. And there may have been more to their worldview, their fatalism than that, but I think that was a big part of it, was just, how close they were to mishap and accidental death. And my chapter in the book, titled Providence, towards the end of the book, is a whole chapter, a short chapter about how Rainy Lake House provisioned itself in a typical year through the seasons. And I called it Providence because the Europeans regarded, almost obsessively, they were looked at how they needed to provide for their food supply through the winter so that they wouldn't starve to death. So they were very deliberate in laying aside, growing the food, laying aside these food supplies, and they were kind of appalled by the way seeming to them, the way the Indians didn't provide for themselves in that same methodical manner, and therefore put themselves at risk of starvation. So there was a real, cultural difference over that. And I thought it was pretty interesting. And I thought that it kind of underscores what you see in the historical records a lot, which is one of the negative attitudes that Europeans held towards Indians was that they were improvident. You see that word improvident a lot, and we don't use that word much now, but the idea being that the Indians kind of lived day to day and didn't plan for the future, and therefore put themselves at risk of starvation. And is one of the ways in which the Europeans saw the Indians as being an inferior culture, and justified their imperial policies towards the Indians was that these were an improvident people. So this all goes back to the question of how they thought about death and their degrees of fatalism, and that was a pretty impressive cultural divide between the Europeans and the Indians. And I guess I would add that it comes out in the Rainy Lake story in another place where, in my interpretation, and Tanner writes about this in his autobiography, but in my interpretation, when he was a boy of about 13 and was really starting to become part of his family, his Indian family, and he was out hunting with his older brother, and they got into trouble. This was in the wintertime, and they got into trouble. I think they broke through some ice and got wet. And Tanner writes about how his brother lay down in a snowbank and prepared himself to die. And Tanner would have nothing to do with that, and searched out some punk to start a fire and built a fire and basically saved both of their lives. And Tanner writes about this and uses the story, I think, to underscore that this sort of fatalistic part of the Indian mindset that he, at that age, and I guess at a later age when he was telling the story, just didn't buy into. So that he was, I think, himself identifying this bit of a kind of a cultural divide.
So Ted, a common narrative is that the fur trade decimated the native cultures that it came in contact with, and if that's a correct description of, or just a generalization of how to think about that in the aftermath of the fur trade, what do you think some of those reasons are, or what are your comments on that question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, everywhere all over the globe, when Europeans came in contact with indigenous peoples, the results were pretty unhappy. And to me, I mean, one big factor in this, of course, that we've learned about is disease, that Europeans brought with them diseases that American Indians especially were not prepared to deal with, because they had been in the Western Hemisphere isolated from old world diseases for so many centuries that they just, the antibody systems, anyway, we all know this story, that the European introduced diseases had a decimating effect on Native American populations. And you see that other places of the world too. But so that's a huge factor we need to remember. But it seems to me that the more universal, another universal thing that was happening when Europeans came in contact with indigenous peoples everywhere was competition over land. And I think, the Indian cultures were interested in maintaining their collective ownership of land, just as Europeans were. The Indian tribes were interested in protecting their hunting grounds. They were also interested in protecting their homelands as cultural spaces, spiritual spaces that they didn't want to give up. So they had their own stake in the land, but Europeans were also interested in exploiting natural resources. And so, and they had a capitalist system that was based on amassing wealth. And so land had a commodity value that they were after. So everywhere, it's almost universal. Everywhere the competition over land was driving this conflict between Europeans and Native peoples. And I guess I could point out as an aside to this that it's been noted that in as much as all peoples have a spiritual connection to the land, Native peoples have a more intense spiritual connection to the land because that the religion is based on that land area and caring for the land, whereas Christians have a kind of a portable, their religion they carry with them in the Bible, so they can go into new lands and they still have their religion. And so I think that made the Native people more vulnerable on that score. So I think that's the basic underlying, to me, the most important factor in this conflict that you see all over the world between Europeans and natives is just a competition for land. And the Europeans had the technology and the structure to get the upper hand and take the land. And that's what happened.
So Ted, if the Northwest Company had prevailed when it came time for the merger, how do you think things would have played out?
Well, I think basically that it would have still ended up a lot the same, in that it would have gone from a situation where there was competing companies to a situation where you had one monopoly. And that would have been the same. You had the Northwest Company come out on top. So to me, in the big scheme of things, it wouldn't have made a huge amount of difference. But I think you can point to some differences in the two corporate cultures. It seems to me that the Northwest Company was structured in a way where it was looking for short-term profits. The way it was distributing shares and promoting shareholders up in the company, it had a little bit more of a cutthroat, exploitative corporate culture, whereas the Hudson Bay Company, I think, was a little bit more conservative and I think it translated into a somewhat more humane corporate policies. For instance, this Hudson Bay Company, I think, was looking a little bit more towards the retirement of its employees. So I think if the Northwest Company had come out on top, it would have been a little bit more of a ruthless company than the Hudson Bay Company was. But that's kind of speculative. But I think, I mean, it's counterfactual history, so it's hard to know. But I think one thing you can say is that before 1821, there was strife because there was competition. And competition, one of the factors that, one of the fallouts from competition, of course, was that there was a lot more alcohol brought into the Indian country, and the Indians were suffering from that. So when you got rid of the competition and created a monopoly, you could get a better handle on that situation. And what you can say is that after 1821, there's an interesting comparison to be made between in Canada, where the Hudson Bay Company had a monopoly, and south of the border, where you still had a fur trade based on competition among several companies. Granted, the American Fur Company was dominant, but there was, it was kind of competition was ruling the day. And so you can see how the fur trade developed in Canada versus in the United States. And a lot of that has to do with monopoly versus competition. And to me, it's pretty clear that the competitive framework in the United States was harder on Indian peoples than the monopolistic framework that the Hudson Bay Company operated with.
Switching back to Tanner. What are your thoughts about the accuracy of Tanner's narrative? I know that that's been tossed up in question. How do you feel about that? What have you run into to validate that?
Yeah, I like that question. And I felt I needed to rewrite the whole postscript in the book to address that. So let me say here that I'll just mention a couple of points I made in the postscript, but then go a little bit beyond that to offer some a little bit more candid appraisal, I guess, of Tanner that didn't go into the postscript. So in the postscript, I think I was pointing out, I mean, it is a very important question. How reliable is Tanner's account? And I think I pointed out two main things that to me made it past that test of reliability. One was that you can find a lot of corroboration for what Tanner says in other sources. And some of those show not only that he was being truthful, but that he had an amazingly precise memory of things. And it's almost an incredible memory from our modern standpoint. But then, part of what you need to take into account is that Tanner grew up in that memory-based culture where there was no writing and people told stories, and you exercise that part of your brain through storytelling. And, so people could remember more than we might imagine that would be possible today. So part of, I think, the test of Tanner's credibility is that there's sources out there that corroborate him. And then the other test that I talk about in the postscript is, I think the term is internal evidence, but if you examine a manuscript and look for inconsistencies or just kind of red flags that make you think that the writer is deceiving you, you can find those in some manuscripts. And in Tanner's case, there's a consistency, a kind of frankness, candidness that makes you trust it. So I think it passes that test of the internal evidence. So by and large, I feel like Tanner stands up as a good source, and I think most, to my sense, is most historians agree that he, as captivity narratives go, he's a pretty trustworthy source. But I will say, to go on and give you a little bit of my sort of candid qualms about Tanner. For one thing, I feel like he is a damaged individual. I feel like he you know, I mean, you can't kidnap somebody from their birth family and persuade them that their family have all been slaughtered and not expect that they would be traumatized for life from that. And I think he showed those markings. He was pretty intense. He had a really hard time maintaining close relationships. And you know, there's things in his narrative that are a little odd. It's been pointed out that he just brags over and over again about how much what a great hunter he was, and some of his details on that are hard to believe. You wonder if he's stretching the truth a little. He obviously is not totally forthcoming about his family relationships, so that's a little troubling. But to me, my biggest qualm about the book is another one unrelated to that, and that is, you know, you have to ask, how much did the editor put into the book, Edwin James? And Edwin James, you know, says that he just took down Tanner's words verbatim, basically, and didn't add anything himself. But that can't strictly be true, because just the way the vocabulary that's in the book, it's just, you know, it can't be Tanner's own words. So you know that the editor is doing something in there, and you just have to trust that he's being pretty faithful to the truth. But the more I learned about Edwin James, the more I wondered if he was editorializing. Because I learned that Edwin James in the 1820s, and I think more even in the 1830s, was pretty involved in the Indian reform movement, meaning the effort to reform federal Indian policy. And Edwin James was this was more in the 1830s than in the 1820s, but it was already starting to develop in the 1820s. There was kind of a divide forming in American opinion between the policy of removal, which was to force Indian tribes to just pick up and move lock, stock, and barrel to the west, to Oklahoma or other, you know, out west, and vacate those lands. And that was based on the sort of the concept that whites and Indians just can't get along. We just have to move them out of here. And then there was a counter movement towards a policy that was eventually adopted, and that was assimilation. And that policy held that, and it was, you know, equally ethnocentric perhaps, but in a different way. It held that it was, I guess, the humanitarian approach had to be to convert Indians into white people, you know, basically teach them white people's ways. And that's what Edwin James subscribed to, was that Indian policy reform towards assimilation. And I think you can kind of see it creeping into his narrative. And I'll give you one example. The way Tanner was so anti-alcohol, commented on what a destructive effect the alcohol was having on Indian people. It may well be that came from Tanner's own life experience, but I just had my doubts that Edwin James was using Tanner as a spokesperson for that sort of Indian reformist perspective. You know, we got to get a handle on controlling the alcohol in the Indian trade. And in that way, Edwin James may have been guilty of using Tanner as kind of that, you know, we refer to the noble savages of holding up an Indian as a way of critiquing what's wrong with our own culture, you know, white way of doing things. And so it may be that Edwin James was modifying or maybe just embroidering a little bit of what Tanner said along those lines. So that's the doubt. And I just felt like I didn't want to put that into the postscript because I didn't want to undermine the great amount of credibility that I think, Tanner does bring to us.
Well, that kind of leads us to the last heavy question, and then I'll let Tom close. What are your observations on the issue of race and the balance or imbalance between trader and native trapper?
Well, I think what's so fascinating about the fur trade is that it brought together these strikingly different cultures, and both cultures wanted something from the other, and so they found ways to. It was all based around exchange of labor, exchange of goods, exchange of knowledge. Like the Indians taught the Europeans how to make birch bark canoes, which was just a huge asset. So initially there was a balance there, and as time went on in this relationship between native peoples and European traders, the balance tipped, and the Indians were pushed towards dependency and subjugation. But I think what you can say is that the fur trade buffered the Indians against that and ameliorated it to some degree, because it was, it was this system based on, mutually wanting something from one another and mutually finding ways to get along. And so as long as there was a fur trade, that clash between Indians and Europeans was softened, I guess, or buffered to some degree. And wherever you look in places of the world where there wasn't much of a fur trade, where the fur trade didn't last very long, where there was other things going on, the culture clash was much, much worse. And, just quickly, I guess one example would be the gold rush in California, where, as they say, the world rushed in there, and it was all about getting the gold. And there was a fur trade, but the fur trade was quickly marginalized. And the picture of Indian-white relations in California is just abominable. It was genocide. And so I think you can look at other places in the world and come to appreciate more how the fur trade really buffered us from those worst case scenarios.
Well, Ted, just amazing amount of information that you brought to us in Rainy Lake House. What are you working on next? What's next what can we look forward to showing up in the bookstore?
Yeah, I'm not a fur trade historian, and my career has really been all about two things: Indian-white relations, and the other thing is national park history, and that's been sort of my bread and butter. But I have another book going. Hopefully, it'll eventually be a published book. That's more along the lines of what I tried to do with Rainy Lake House. That is, narrative, character-driven history. And this one is about a young woman in Arkansas in the Civil War, and so that's what when I'm not doing contract work for the Park Service, it's what I'm plugging along on. And I think it'll be a short book, character driven around this one woman's experience and her the two men in her life, consecutive. during the Civil War, illuminating the horrors of the guerrilla war side of the Civil War in certain parts of the South, and it's also it's a true story based on her autobiography, sort of like John Tanner wrote his autobiography, but it's also a romantic story. So that's that's my project right now. I hope it'll come to a book sometime. Oh, you're on mute.
The bane of Zoom. This has been great.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for cutting out some time today, and
It was a pleasure.
thanks to me for making this all come together on Zoom. And look forward to talking to you again.
All right. Thank you.